Well, good day. I'm actually looking at doing an A to Z of philosophy terms. I thought that'd be more interesting than A to Z because I'm not a booktuber, just a reader. Um, and then I'm going to do a review of a book that I finished this morning, which was The Gift of Imperfection by Brene Brown. Also, yeah, it relates to some of the stuff we were talking about. But what I wanted to share was actually something that kind of got me excited, sharing your top 10 physical books that you're looking forward to reading. And it kind of coincides with the reread because some of them are different translations of a book that I've read before, right? So, no particular order. I just grabbed them off the shelf. I'll try to put them in a bit of order here, the stuff that I've mentioned. Okay. So, first one, I've mentioned this already. I'm already being kind of silly with the annotations. I know I say I don't usually mark up my books terribly, but this book is profound. This is The Great Code, The Bible in Literature by Northrop Frye. I think it goes deeper than literature. It goes into language, culture, and just metaphor, understanding. I've talked about this before, that the Chinese language has with its stories built into uh, the characters themselves. So the language is one of myth, as is ours, but we risk losing that meaning, that understanding, that complexity if we don't understand where it comes from. Now, it's not just simply in the Bible, it's also in poetry, it's also in many other areas in life. But until we remember this truth, right? Next, I've mentioned this one as well. Go Set a Watchman. I'm about 30 or 40% through. It's tough to say. I'm a slow reader. Go Set a Watchman. This is Harper Lee's follow up To Kill a Mockingbird. Wonderful. Wonderful. I'm looking very forward. Right now, it's just kind of a build up, just so you get to know where she's at this point now in her life. Great job. This is after when she's older. Great. This actually I'm rereading because a friend of mine mentioned how interested he was in the Lankavatara. And then I know someone on YouTube who's actually got the permission from Bill Porter, Red Pine, the translator, to read this on YouTube. So definitely an avenue. I tried to do a reading group of the Lankavatara, this particular translation. But actually, I've had more people drop out than stick in because once you start to read it, it is a little bit difficult. So maybe reading and listening might make it easier. I'm rereading it because I absolutely adore this book. This is the heart of Zen, of Yogacara, but it's also, it resonates in so many other philosophies and religions around the world. They share far more than they like to admit, right? Speaking of which, I have this really cool book, which I want to read again, but technically it will be a reading because I've mentioned reading it, but I've never actually gone through, and done a review or anything like that. But rereading The Imitation of Christ. This is a book by Thomas à Kempis. It is really old. It was originally published in like 1584 or something like that. This translation is one of the most recent published more recently. And the reason why I actually wanted to read this is because not only did Carl Jung love the book, because of its phenomenology of self. Really, if you take out the mention of God and Christ in this, it really could be you speaking to yourself. And really, you know, it's interesting. But what's also interesting is Jung used this to establish his own format for his red book, his Liber Novus. He calls it Liber Novus, which is exactly how this was broken up. Now, keep in mind, it was written in Latin. So, but it's very clear that Carl Jung's red book, which is, there's a little sneaky little 11th pick, which I will be reading again, is his Liber Novus, Carl Jung's red book. inspired by Nietzsche, and like I said, the Imitation of Christ. In fact, in Nietzsche's works, he mentions that he wanted to create something as wonderful as Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, but he didn't feel he had it in him. I believe he was speaking to Salome, and I think she agreed. Self limiting beliefs, am I right? That man created stuff, I mean, arguably even better because instead of asking the questions, he really did give us some at least pointers to where we ourselves should find those answers. This one here is kind of cool. I've mentioned it before, but I haven't read it. I've read some of the poems, but this is Poems of the Irish People. It from Fall River Press in New York. I'm trying to see if there's an editor mention, which is why I moved right away. Neither here nor there, but Poems of the Irish People. This one's somewhat interesting because it breaks it down into areas. So it breaks it down into land. Where is it here? Land, and I believe it's land, people, lore. Yep. Land, people, and lore. So this was kind of cool. It's got like a fake leather bound quality to it, and it's got some old timey kind of writing in it. But it's just beautiful. Some of the poetry is very nice. Some of it new to me. Most of it new to me. This was just an accidental pickup, this book, and I'm actually looking forward to reading it. You don't see much because it didn't come with the dust jacket, and I've wrapped it in some plastic. This here is called The Velveteen Principles. Hidden Wisdom from a Children's Classic, a guide to becoming real. I love that because that's literally what A Gift of Imperfection, Brene Brown, ooh, another sneaky drop, so that's 12 bucks. Brene Brown mentioned this idea that through creativity and endeavor, we can, find our agency, right? This here is technically a reread, but it's also a new read. This is one of those weirdos. When you read multiple translations of a book, that's what sometimes happens. So this is supposedly one of the newest translations of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. As you know, the Chinese Book of Change, the I Ching, my favorite translation, Master Huang's, I think he calls it the complete or the essential I Ching, but it's the one by Master Huang, Huang. My love, that's 13th book. My love of the Chinese philosophy also includes the art of war, or arguably, I say, the art of peace, right? Because when you learn that the Chinese idea of mu, which made its wu, I apologize, mu's something different. The idea of wu, which went over to Japan as bu, is not a martial way. It's actually a character that means to stop a sword. So arguably it's the way of peace, which is why it resonated for me. And it's funny too, because I was raised to become a military. I mean, I don't know how many generations. I was supposed to be a military guy, but when the Royal Military College in Canada turned me down with adjusted grades of about 87.5%, I worked so hard to get in. And they told me, nope, sorry, the lowest mark we let in last year was 94. Imagine someone who had read Sun Tzu and Clausewitz. Oh, there's 14. Clausewitz on war, recommend it. And Rommel. Rommel Papers is, I guess, the book I'd recommend. So there's 15. I was pretty upset that, I felt it ridiculous. You have a bunch of book nerds for officers, leading men. That's bad enough. But I was actually what would you call, we won't even go into that. So, that's where I went into philosophy. Economics, technically, but to me, and it looks like Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, there's 16 books. He mentions that economics truly is a philosophy, right? So here's another book that I got, and I'm looking forward to reading, but I haven't even bothered really to even pick it up. This is the, pardon my pronunciation, this is the Kebra Nagast. It's the Lost Bible of the Rastafarian. It's a wisdom and faith from Ethiopia and Jamaica. Gerald Hausman with an introduction by Ziggy Marley. And why I find that interesting is Ziggy Marley's, I believe it was his first album with the Melody Makers. And I've always flown my freak flag high. And so you might have thought it was weird because I was made fun of because of my love for Ziggy Marley. And that album, I'm going to have to listen to it right after this. I highly recommend it. Ziggy Marley and the Conscious Party, I believe was the album. Ziggy Marley and the Melody Makers, Conscious Party, I think it was called. It was just, it's phenomenal. The message, the music. So it was my soundtrack for my early years when I talked about reading W.B. Du Bois and Black Like Me and Malcolm X. As a young Irish kid with obviously a mix, it really resonated for me. Kind of the same as yesterday. Neil Diamond's America resonates for me because as an Irish person living in Canada, our place is always been fairly tenuous. Prior to the last 10 years, it was because, right, there were signs, right? No Irish, no dogs. And then recently, we seem to be lumped in with what's called the oppressor class, in spite of having probably one of the richest understandings of what it is to be oppressed, being amongst the people who were among the first slaves in the New World, who were under the boot heel of an oppressor for nearly a millennium, maybe more. And during the Engortamor, the Great Famine, there was more than enough food being exported back to England. So it's important that we read some of this stuff, right? Because, you know, the history is written by the victor, but at the same time, right, it's two sides to every story. I talked about this before, that I found our binary positions on so many things truly might be an evolutionary process, right? We're always on a binary, them versus us. And I think it's meant to teach the middle of us to be more compassionate, more considerate to ourselves and to each other. So there's another reference to Brene Brown's The Gift of Impermanence. Pardon me for quoting it again. I just read it this morning. But she talks about this in her book. So I'll just leave it at that. I recommend the book. Okay, so this here is, I guess, can I say some Apocrypha? Because there's some additional books within the Ethiopian canon that's not shared everywhere else. I showed you that New American Bible that I picked up, the Catholic edition, because of some of the books, the Book of Wisdom, for example, Baruch, some of these books that are only in that particular Bible. Right? Picked it up so I can read them, right? I don't know if that would count, though. I think I mentioned it before. Read what you own. I will be reading, and I have actually read, I can't remember, not all of the books that, not all of the Apocrypha, as they say. The next book is a book I have read more times than I could probably count. I have more translations than I could think off the top of my head. I've read many more than that as well, listened to many as well. There's many audiobooks out there, the Bhagavad Gita, which is the great song or the song of creation, song of, you could interpret it how you like. We won't go down that road. This one is actually a two-piece, and it's got a funny little story. I get all my books, physical books, from the thrift store because I can't afford retail. The price of books nowadays, I'm kidding. I get some books retail, but just the price of some of this stuff. is shocking. So I look in the thrift stores, and if there's something that I cannot get elsewhere, um, you know, I'll buy retail. But again, as I've said, many of the books that I love are out of print. So sometimes thrift is the only option for me, right? And so that being said, after all these years of reading and studying the Gita, I had no idea that Yogananda had produced such a giant. But technically, after some research, it's not. It's been put together by the foundation later. So it's kind of a mixture of Yogananda, uh, yeah, Yogananda and his organization after. But neither here nor there. I am looking forward to reading, even if there's only a couple pages of what Yogananda had to say about the Bhagavad Gita, and looking forward to it. Why? Seems weird, but here's your 360, and I guess I'll talk about a 16th book. Um, One of my favorite books by Leo Tolstoy, surprisingly, is not what most people think. It's actually The Kingdom of Heaven is in You, which is, like Hemingway, a line from the Bible. But what I love about it is Tolstoy spent, I think, about 10 years studying the teachings of Christ, because he found that people weren't following the true teachings of Jesus. And so he endeavored to find the truth. And then when he did find what he found, he was excommunicated, because some things like all killing is bad, it's murder, that wasn't accepted by the ruling class, who needed to convince, in his explanation, officers needed to convince the soldiers they were guiding to commit, right? And I've talked about this before. Interestingly enough, human beings tend to not want to take another life. I think it was the Second World War. They did a study and they found that 70% of soldiers fired, either consciously or unconsciously, above the enemy's heads. And so there was some change in training to get people to be a little more dehumanizing of their enemy. And there's where the Bhagavad Gita comes in, right? As Martin Buber said, right, it's about I and thou. It's not about I and them, or I and it. So that's what? Book 17. Highly recommend Martin Buber's I and Thou. And he talks about this idea that the reason why there is so much trouble in the world is because, and Carl Jung said this, he said most evil can be sourced to the fact that most people walk around, and I'll add, and act completely unconscious. And that's what it has to do with this, right? There's a Sanskrit expression that I love, and it's Tattvam Asi. It's often translated, I think even Joseph Campbell translated it as I am God, but I prefer to translate it as I am that, which resonates with the Hebrew when Moses approached the burning bush. He asked, well, what shall I call you, or who are you? And the response came as Esher Esher. I am that. So I love that resonance. And so that's why I love the Bhagavad Gita, because, believe it or not, it wasn't the Gita that inspired Gandhi. It was actually Leo Tolstoy's book about the teachings of Christ and the kingdom of heaven is in you that made him realize that the teachings in the Gita, same, were how we live our lives and how we find our way through a toxic, maybe even an oppressor situation, which he succeeded with non-violent activism, right? So I'm super looking forward to this. I absolutely love the Bhagavad Gita. And if you're interested, within the Bhagavad Gita, it teaches not just yoga, but also meditation and the nature of self. This truly is the ultimate book. I think that, well, here's another book, Emerson's essays that was, they were carried around by Nietzsche when he was writing his books. I think if Nietzsche, his buddy, Paul Deussen, up the road from him, if his buddy had been able to translate the Gita a little bit more in depthly, I think this would have inspired Nietzsche as much as Emerson, because for some reason Emerson got the message from what he read. Emerson likely read the translations of the Upanishads and the Gita translated by Anquetil de Perron. Does that count as another book recommendation? But he was an early French translator of Sanskrit, Indologist, as they like to be called. But I cannot recommend the Bhagavad Gita more highly. My favorite translation used to be Eknath Easwaran. The reason why I recommend him is he was an English professor and a Sanskrit professor. And being someone that spent 30 years studying Sanskrit, it ain't easy. It ain't easy. So if you have someone who is proficient in both of those languages, and you're a Westerner like me whose first language is English, probably one of your best options. Now, there's a few other options out there that are wonderful. Some of the commentaries better in other books. But as far as the translation, with a very basic introduction to the different chapters, there seems to be nothing better. Possibly soon to be supplanted by my new favorite. Possibly. I've started reading this a little bit, and it is wonderful. The way it works is it doesn't provide the Sanskrit, but so here's a little story of my journey. This is partially how I have studied, and I'll give you a why. So I could be a little misleading, and I could say that I haven't studied the Sanskrit in the actual written Sanskrit, the different characters, you know what I mean? I've studied the Sanskrit using the phonetic, I guess, the Western equivalent, make it easier for us to pronounce. Now, the reason why I could say, well, that's how they used to do it. Like, there wasn't until fairly recently that I got an edition of the Dhammapada. Could have approached 20 books, I think. One of my favorite translations of the Dhammapada includes the actual Sanskrit characters. Then it provides what you see here. I know it's terrible to see, but it provides the translation or the transliteration, I think is what they call it, right? So in this case, it's Tasya Samjanyan Harsem Karuvraja. Right? So I could lie and say, oh, well, that's how they were all published, because I'm so old that they've changed how we pronounce some of this stuff 3 times now, the Sanskrit. But the real reason is I'm actually just interested in understanding the text better. I'm not interested in becoming a scholar. I've told you this before, that I have a buddy who studied with me Greek, and he went so deep down into Koine Greek scholarship that he doesn't seem to understand basic things, because he's only studying New Testament, right? Because that's really all that former Greek is for. I mean, me, I was studying, yes, to understand that, but also to understand, where our language comes from, right? There's so much in Greek that can inform, English and French and German and Italian and you name it, Spanish, right? But the real reason why I never bothered to learn how to read the Sanskrit is I'm very verbal. And because I was so dyslexic, I, for some reason, just understood that I would never learn how to read Sanskrit without impinging on learning all of the other stuff. I've talked about this before. I believe my job is to learn how to develop a truly modern version of a Renaissance education, what Jung asked us to do, which was to study the Western canon, obviously, but also the Eastern canon, right? And by doing so, we can learn more about ourselves. The example I give is Jung talked about how there is a different mind, East and West, right? And when you actually study this, pardon me, I got an itch. Remember, I'll warn everybody growing a mustache, it's crazy. Oh, my mustache itches me all the time, but mostly when I'm doing something like this, not when I'm reading or busy. It keeps me distracted. It's a funny little thing, ain't it? And I lost what I was going to say. Well, I guess that's lost for. You can mention it in the comments if it was something that was even relevant, or if anyone's still watching. I'll I'll remember if someone reminds me. So the final book of the 10 I selected, ignore the other 10 that I mentioned in passing, because I could also mention 3 or 4 related to this one. This here is a book that I picked up recently. I don't know anything about it. The reviews seem great. The details that I have read seem canon. I don't see a problem with it. I've mentioned this before. Tantra has a bit of a bad name because one guy moved to Ohio and started teaching just the sex side of it, and it just got creepy from there, right? You know, Tantra is just a practice that understands that if nature, creation, divinity, providence, whatever you want to call it, if it infuses everything, then everything we can and do is divine if engaged in with the right mindset and outset. And which is, by the way, here's a Sanskrit word for you, Shraddha. Shraddha is a word that means confidence, commitment, and devotion, which is what we should be practicing, right? In everything we do. So this one here is called Tantra, the Path of Ecstasy. It's not what you think. It's not strictly sex, because ecstasy, Ananda, right? I just talked about Yogananda. His name means yoke to bliss, but it could also be considered ecstasy, right? There's a common power phrase in Vedanta that is Tattvam Asi. My brain is gone. I apologize. This is why I'm doing it early in the morning here, because a couple hours from now, my brain won't work at all anymore. I get so tired. But Om Tat Sat. Om Tat Sat. But what's the one with Ananda? Hold on. Yeah, I mean, it's joy, it's bliss, it could be ecstasy. Hold on here. We'll go to Britannica, and it might have the actual power phrase I'm looking at. Oh, well, you'll find it if you go and do a search. Sat Chit Ananda. Sat Chit Ananda. So Sat is being, or creation, I should say, kind of tied. Chit is self or mind or thought, and Ananda being bliss, which is the whole of creation. That's the idea, right? So this has a final. It's the reason why I grabbed this. This is from Shambhala Publishing, so it's usually fairly good. He's got just tons and tons of notes and an index, which I like a lot. So I'm guessing it's going to be pretty good. It surprised me because I thought I'd actually read the majority of the books on Tantra, like the ones that are scholarly works, right? Because this is not your usual book on Tantra. Oh, he's even got some mudras, right? Showing you how to count, right? Using your fingers. So there's some mudras, right? It's interesting. Not usually something that they would put in here. So this seems to be, I've looked at it as well, but it seems to be a bit of a blend between scholarly and practitioner insight. So it might be of interest, right? Because not all of these works are done with a mind to a practitioner. I mentioned this yesterday that it's not often you'll find a scholar and a practitioner. It's more often you'll find a scholar who's a non-practitioner or a practitioner who's a non-scholar. Um, and I've seen that in other areas as well. Very few people tend to read their own source materials, right? So on that, have a lovely day.